the week of the 27th. We have 3 talks and not 2. There's a talk on Tuesday given by Margareta Harris, who is one of our postdoctoral fellows. There's a talk on Friday, as usual, given by Dan Nicholson. But on Thursday, we also have another talk at noon given by Raphael Scholl. And because we need to motivate you to come, we'll go beyond the usual bagels. So there will be something a bit different. Try. I know, Sandy. Isn't that very exciting? more than bagels. So please come and join us for that talk by Raphael Scholl at noon on empirical tests of infectious disease models. On the other announcement that we've extended by 2 weeks the deadline for the conference on science and values that Arnon Levy is organizing at the center for his senior visiting fellowship. So you have until November 30th to submit your abstract if you so want. In fact, we already have a lot of them, but now maybe we'll even have a few more. So if you haven't had time to submit it but wanted to submit it, please do so. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Alan Love, who many of you know. I suspect pretty much all of you know, but I will do my duty as director of the center. Alan got his PhD here at Pitt in 2005. In fact, we did overlap for a few months, really not a really long time. And he's been at the University of Minnesota since 2006. So it's been actually quite a long time there. He's now the distinguished Mike Knight University professor at the University of Minnesota since 2022. And he has been for nearly 10 years, 9 years, if his CV is to be believed, the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. So Alan was very keen on insisting when I visited a few months ago that his center was older than my center. We should talk a little bit, okay? But which is actually a fact. So, it's hard to debate this fact if you're not Trump. If you're Trump, it's not so much of an issue, but if you're not Trump, so it's a very important center. If you have never visited, it has been really redone in a beautiful manner with lovely pictures and historical documents on the wall. Alan does history and philosophy of biology. He's been working on many areas in philosophy of biology, but his original focus was on Evo, but the work has been really broadened extensively over the years, not only in the philosophy of biology, but also in other areas of philosophy of science, toward more general question in general philosophy of science, reduction, historical sciences, and more general question in philosophy, role of intuition, and that kind of question. Recently, he's been doing also some work on the replication crisis, some work on the methodology of science as well. One thing which I'm very sorry for him is being the leader, the PI of a multi-million-dollar grant with the John Templeton Foundation, a $10 million grant or something like that? $15 million grant with the John Templeton Foundation. Having had one which is much smaller, I can only express, but it's almost over. The title of the grant, which was an extremely impressive, was Agency, Directionality, and Function, Foundations for a Science of Purpose, which involved an enormous group of researchers, both in philosophy, in sociology, and in other sciences all over the world with postdoctoral and PIs. It's really an impressive project. If you don't know anything about it, have a look on the web. It's really a remarkable project. He's published more than 100 articles. I started to count, and then I got bored after page 5 of his CV. This is just not worth it. So I wrote, it must be about 100 or 100 plus, really, on all these topics in the best journals in philosophy, but also in many journals in the sciences. Actually, he's been regularly published in top journal PNAS, the Proceedings of the Royal Society, and so on and so forth. We are really delighted to have him today. Thanks for coming. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Edward. A overly generous introduction. I'm very happy to be back, to see old friends and new faces, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So what I want to talk about is the biological trait concept and character identity mechanisms. And For some of you, this might be some new space, but I'm just going to jump right in and start to sort of lay out some of the groundwork for where I want to go. So it's unsurprising and not at all strange that biologists frequently talk about characters, traits, features, phenotypes, and parts to pick out those aspects of organisms they want to study using a variety of different methods. You can see this picking up journal articles, you can see it in textbook references and all kinds of places. However, they accomplish this in diverse and sometimes seemingly contradictory ways. The diversity is, again, not surprising because we've all encountered these at some point, either in education or in research. There's just a lot of different things that biologists will call traits or characters. And that sometimes they do so in seemingly contradictory ways, such as using the same name for a different kind of part. One of those, the developmental mesomeres of vertebrate mesoderm and anatomical mesomeres and pectoral fins of fish. They're not the same thing, but it's the same word. And for some researchers, a feather is a part with attributes, but for others, size, shape, or color are characters with different character states. So we can have basically the same property or feature treated either as a character or character state, depending on who is talking. Now, we all have heard a very ancient phrase because it is around in lots of different discussions, carving nature at the joints. But it is long in the tooth for a reason, because it reflects a question about trying to somehow get at the reality of what a trait is. And Richard Lewontin expressed this back in 2001. How are we to recognize the true characters of organisms rather than imposing upon them arbitrary divisions? No issue is of greater importance in the study of biology. And for those who know a little bit of history about Lewontin and his collaboration with Stephen Jay Gould on the spandrels of San Marco, you will perhaps remember that this was broached in that paper as well, though not something they spent as much time on. We must omit an extended discussion of the vital issue, what is a trait? Some evolutionists may regard this as a trivial or merely a semantic problem. It is not. Organisms are integrated entities, not collections of discrete objects. Now, the commitments that are being expressed there in terms of organisms as integrated entities is kind of a presumption or a theoretical presumption that is not cashed out, but it certainly is something we can find in history. And just for a historical thumbnail, and because I was a student of Jim Lennox, I have to have Aristotle in my talk. For Aristotle, a hand severed from the body of a living organism or still attached to the body of a dead one is a hand in name only. Aristotle clearly had a background theory about what counts as a bodily part. A part is genuine only in the context of the whole to which it belongs that enables proper functioning, which then gives you criteria for talking about parts, because the severed hand is out of its organismal context and unable to work appropriately, and the hand of a dead individual can no longer operate correctly because the organism has lost its functional integrity. Now, as much as there is good reason to go back to Aristotle for a number of things, that's not what most contemporary biologists are doing. And I think that's not necessarily surprising, in part because the lack of a shared background theory for what counts as a trait reflects some of the incredible disciplinary diversity that we see in contemporary life science. As Rosenberg and Neander have opined, biology encompasses many different fields of specialization, and there will be no one-size-fits-all formula for taxonomizing biological traits. And naming practices themselves can be misleading for reasons we've already seen. The wings of birds and wings of beetles are not directly comparable, but human hands, cat paws, and horse feet are the same. So we have a neglect. The theoretical question of what constitutes a biological trait has not been systematically explored in contemporary life science, certainly not as a collaborative endeavor by more than a few scattered scientists. But in fact, it's something that philosophers for quite some time recognized was needed. And back in 1969, David Hall actually said, hey, this might be a place where philosophers can be of some assistance to the biologists in looking at the question of what is a character. And I think he is right. So here's what I want to do in the time that I have today. I want to begin by simply looking at how biologists talk about traits, giving some examples of biologists sort of trying to think about what they mean when they invoke traits. And then I want to shift to asking what should we expect from the trait concept. And here I want to first talk about an array of problematic options, things that I don't think work, and then turn to some epistemological considerations about concepts that I think help us see a different position for how we might understand the trait concept. And then as a part of that, what I want to do is actually show you a little bit about how we might advance theory on biological traits in such a way that's conducive to what we should expect from the trait concept. And that is by introducing to you to at least a few bits of the character identity mechanism model or framework that I've been working on for the last few years that I think fits that bill. So let's start with some examples of places where biologists sort of advance at least statements of some kind about characters or traits. So the National Human Genome Research Institute at the NIH has a glossary on their website. And a trait as related to genetics is a specific characteristic of an individual. Traits can be qualitative or quantitative. A given trait is part of an individual's overall phenotype. Phenotype refers to an individual's observable traits such as height, eye color, and blood type. Now, the first thing I think that you should be struck with is how underwhelming this is in terms of what it actually tells you, apart from, yes, it could be qualitative or quantitative, how helpful. When you move into some specific areas like ecology, we get a little bit more of a sort of digging into the issue. So there, the authors say there's currently a high degree of confusion in the use, not only of the term trait itself, but also in the underlying concepts it refers to. A trait is any morphological, physiological, or phenological feature measurable at the individual level from the cell to the whole organism. Again, we might think that this too sounds like it's a relatively capacious type definition that includes potentially too much. But of course, these authors actually are more interested in a particular thing that they call a functional trait, which are defined in terms of the way they impact fitness indirectly via their effects on growth, reproduction, and survival. So in this case, we see, I think, motivations for getting clear about trait come from a particular interest in what traits should be doing and how they play a role in a particular research program. Now, there's some tensions in how we think about traits. And so you can sort of see it here in that the oftentimes you get, we want something well-defined and measurable, but then we also get traits or anything. So you sort of wonder, can you have it both ways? It's anything that can be well-defined and measurable. And maybe some of the things we can measure might not be well-defined. So there's some inherent tensions in the way that biologists are talking about traits, at least in the sense that they don't seem like they're going to generate a single set of criteria that will admit all of the things we want to call traits and do so without some kind of contradiction or concern. Now, a number of initial questions emerge out of these sorts of statements. Of course, nobody actually says what it means for something to be well-defined or what it means to be observable, what counts as measurable. Again, whether or not it does imply quantification, because in fact, quantification would bring with it other questions about how you might think about traits and whether they might admit of other constructs. What counts as the individual level? You'll notice that was baked into a lot of the statements. What happens if it's ambiguous, given that there's actually a lot of concern about what counts as an individual in biology, or if it's conceptualized differently? Is used comparatively equivalent to being used appropriately in comparisons? What standards are we using? Oftentimes, I think they're implicit standards that everybody working in an area is operating with but not talking about. But then also this concern that just any feature seems just vacuously general. It just seems like it captures way too much. Now, to some degree, there's humility on the part of biologists about these difficulties, but it also sometimes places where there appears to be a little bit of overconfidence. And so in this textbook on cladistics, I think we get a little bit of a snapshot of this, where the authors say, what is required for taxonomic studies is the sorting of good characters from bad characters. By good and bad, we mean those characters we understand properly. Okay, that makes sense. We would hope that the good ones are the ones we understand properly. But what exactly do you have in mind when you say understand properly? We have spent a great deal of time studying our organisms, so we can have some confidence in our judgment of what is and is not a character. Analysis is somewhat irrelevant. And so you get a little bit of the impression that they're saying, nothing to see here, go away. We're experts, we've got this handled. But in fact, it's quite clear from our earlier examples that there's a lot of issues here, and ones that we certainly wouldn't want to just say, oh, you're the expert, we trust you, you've got this, no problem. I think Dan McShay has nicely highlighted this. Reliance on gestalts and uncontroversial parts is quite limiting, to say the least. But there is one simple fact to keep in view in all of this discussion, which is that biologists do appear to routinely succeed in referring to traits, characters, and features in such a way that they answer research questions of interest. Doesn't mean they always do that, but it would be a pretty weird error theory to say that they were mostly doing it wrong all the time. Right? And so keeping that fact in view, I think, allows us to recognize that, yes, some of the practices are working, but we need a better account of how they're working, because certainly some of the statements among the scientists themselves are not always illuminating in that regard. Okay, so now I want to talk about philosophical expectations on the concept of a trait, and thinking about what kinds of concerns we should have in trying to understand how it works. So what I'm going to start with is a couple options that arise from biologists as well as philosophers in how you might think about this situation. The first is just a kind of conventionalism. Evolution is a complex, messy process. We should not expect clear comparable joints for organismal parts or phenotypes. That's just what evolution produces, and so we're not ever going to get the account of joints, and so biologists just define things as they need to do the work. The fundamental nature of evolution is that its dynamics are about context and differences that can't automatically be extrapolated to other situations. Evolution generates messy, statistically noisy results that must only satisfy the theorem that what is what has survived best. That's the anthropologist Kenneth Weiss. In a population genetics context, Orr has actually stated it more cleanly. Any species is divisible into an infinite number of characters. Now, importantly, Orr was not endorsing that view in the article, but it was highlighting that many evolutionary biologists actually do endorse that kind of a view. Now, there's a lot of immediate worries that you might have about conventionalism. How do we distinguish artifacts from genuine findings without a standard when we're talking about simply any feature we want? Could the success in answering the research questions be illusory? What about trait proliferation? It seems like there's some problem if we do have an infinite number of traits. That doesn't seem like we want to get there. And even if evolution is messy and functional equivalence is widespread, there might be reasons to adopt particular abstractions or idealizations of traits rather than others, and not all traits are likely to be equally messy or unstable over relevant timescales. And the conventionalism doesn't have a good way of capturing that. The second option might be called functional monism. All traits are potentially linked to fitness and thus are functional by definition. So it's from biologists, but we can also get it from philosophers. All significant biological kinds, including homologies, are implicitly or explicitly to be characterized in terms of selected effect functions, that is, ones with a consequence etiology. So I think this one has certain kinds of attractions, of course, because the fitness effects, for example, of function-related traits is certainly relevant to a lot of inquiry, especially in evolution. But again, we, I think, can have some immediate worries about that. It's difficult to handle widely used practices of structural individuation that intentionally abstract away from functional considerations. It leads to a proliferation of traits, as many things can be defined as fitness affecting functional. In fact, this is a concern that some researchers that are a part of the project I'm involved in are trying to address. And it encourages the atomization of the organism into separate units without appreciation of their correlations or shared underlying connections. And this is actually a reiteration of the Gould and Lewontin point that we saw earlier on. That kind of atomization is one of the things they highlight. A third option, developmental or structural monism, as the name suggests, focuses on different properties as the basis for characters. So Williams and Ebach were the authors of the Biologists textbook. A homologue is a part of an organism, usually abstracted from a part of a specimen or specimens. All organisms might be viewed as being made of parts, such that each organism can be broken into its structural components. A trait is an aspect of the whole or of a certain portion of the developmental pattern of the organism. This is the paper that Dobzhansky wrote called What is an Adaptive Trait back in 1956. And more recently, Paul Griffiths' biological discussion of the character concept proceeds against a general background assumption that characters are homologies individuated by common ancestry or common developmental mechanisms. Now, at this point, none of you will be surprised that the next slide looks like this. Worries, because there can be concerns as well about this kind of a view. Structuralism works most naturally for structures. However, many features of organisms are not well accommodated in that way, say talking about rates. Biologists routinely appeal to functional traits. It'd be really strange to have sort of function be so downgraded in this way. Empirically, we know underlying developmental mechanisms are replaceable. So how is that going to work with making somehow development the basis? And here you have the opposite tendency of the functional monism and conventionalism, which is a tendency towards holism and an overly integrated view of the organism and its parts, which is in some respects not empirically supported. So I think what is actually going on here in these options is that they are manifestations of positions that go with a false dichotomy. And it's a false dichotomy that we saw early on in the Lewontin quote, right? How are we to recognize true characters of organisms rather than imposing upon them arbitrary divisions? And in fact, we can find that same false dichotomy elsewhere among biologists. Here's another example. Are characters a methodological artifact, or do they represent fundamental elements of living organization? And as we sometimes say in Minnesota, when we are reading philosophers and biologists, one should always beware when philosophers and biologists begin using profanity, like the F word, fundamental or foundational, because it usually signals that there isn't really an argument, but somebody is banging their fist on the table. So I think that in these false dichotomies, you can actually see where our problematic options tend to fall. That is, for the true characters or fundamental elements, versions of monism really map onto answers to that kind of approach or that kind of take on the dichotomy. whereas conventionalism maps onto the arbitrary divisions more naturally. And I think that a step forward can be made by simply rejecting that framing and thinking about what else we could be doing. And I think that what else can be labeled a principled pluralism. There's more than one legitimate theoretical answer to what counts as a trait. However, there needs to be a theoretical answer. That is, not anything goes. And this kind of principled pluralism is something that I think is responsive to the scientists themselves worrying about this kind of question. So this might be a little bit hard to see at a distance, but this is a trait by biologists looking at and asking other biologists how they use the trait concept and discovering that the discrepancies were not explained by subdiscipline, system or study, or respondent characteristics, suggesting there could be an inconsistent understanding, even among those working in related topics. Previous studies have called for unification of terminology, yet our study shows that proposed definitions are not consistently used or accepted. So recalling Hall, right, is there a way the philosopher can enter into this space from the perspective of a principled pluralism and make sense of the terminological heterogeneity and inconsistency? I think a first step in that direction is to recognize that there are different dimensions to those different theoretical answers. Like many central concepts in biology, there appear to be multiple non-arbitrary interpretations that correspond to different aims across different contexts, different investigative roles, different methods or approaches, different research questions, different model systems, all of which admit within and across disciplines of distinct conceptions of character or trait. So when we think about how to understand what factors are relevant to these differences, we need to make sure we have a rich enough possibility space for the sorts of variables that make a difference. In addition to that recognition, I think we immediately move into a space of thinking about how concepts behave, because one of the things that we also see accompanying those different dimensions is that interpretations are often together with distinct patterns of additional concept use that correlate with the central concept, something that might be termed a conceptual neighborhood. So we already have seen a little bit of this. Sometimes there's a distinction between character and character state, and the way that gets cashed out turns out to give us information about character itself, because we can get an understanding of the way those theoretical commitments are coming through. Additionally, relevant properties that are under scrutiny. Are we talking about anatomy or biochemistry? Are we talking about quantitative or qualitative characters and the associated concepts that come along with them? Probably one of the largest that affects discussions of traits in the conceptual neighborhood is the relevance of hierarchy or levels of organization. In thinking about this, and again, shout out to Aristotle, somebody who clearly recognized that levels of organization were important in thinking about the parts of animals. So we see, and this is just one example, scientists worrying out loud about this kind of hierarchical movement and how to think about the definition of a character. So Bach and von Wollert say establishing the limits of features in a character complex poses a major problem. Should, for example, a muscle bone unit be considered as a single feature, or should this unit be considered as a character complex that can be divided into smaller units? The muscle and the bones to which it attaches. Is the hind limb of a tetrapod, which everyone would agree is a character complex, a single feature or a series of smaller features? And what we see oftentimes is that there's different comfort levels in moving around in the hierarchy into the space of research questions, investigative roles, model systems that people are interested in, but maybe not always stated explicitly as such. Now, one of the things that we see here is that in the trait concept interpretations, we clearly have divergent interpretations. If we're thinking about this in terms of language think about it as different meanings, call it polysemy. And if we just compare phylogenetic systematics, functional traits, and developmental individuation frameworks, we get the following patterns emerging, and I think pretty robustly. What can be a character for one could be a state for the other, and vice versa. What is a character for one might not be anything for the other, and vice versa. The absence of character states have meaning in one context and not the other. And the criteria for characters are more or less stringent and different in one context compared to the other. So when we're talking about divergent interpretations, these divergent interpretations yield not just slight shades of meaning difference, but can actually yield completely opposite, that's a character, no, that's not a character, kind of judgments. So we need to continue, I think, to foreground dimensions of how concepts behave. So I've highlighted conceptual neighborhoods and ways in which key things like levels of organization enter in, but also the type of disunity which might be thought to be seen in that differences of interpretation is sometimes considered to be an untoward outcome in the analysis of biological concepts, possibly even a cop-out. Like that's something that should be corrected or fixed. That's where philosophers should come in and do the cleanup work and show this is what you should be doing. We should knock those out, clean it up. Here's your concept. Thank you very much. However, I think it is now well documented that major concepts in biology and other science exhibit this kind of architecture productively. That is, the kinds of divergence in interpretations is not a bug, but a feature. It is something that is leveraged actively and helps scientists do their work. Multiple accounts of traits are routinely reused within and across disciplinary approaches, as we've already seen, investigative roles, model systems, methodologies, such that in some cases, formal contradictions and puzzles emerge. We could have given that kind of talk about another concept. We don't need to talk about traits to get at that because we're talking in some sense about something more general about scientific concepts. And here, Mark Wilson's work, Julie Burston's work, this is not something unique to biology. This is something that we see in different scientific contexts. And I'm happy that Mark is here because Mark gets a nice shout out for his book because I think he captures this nicely. Philosophical diagnoses of conceptual disharmony can proceed along more profitable trajectories if their practitioners recognize that the generating sources of their puzzles might well lie within the descriptive ingredients that fail to fit together as an integral whole. So this is, again, the shift from seeing it as a bug to seeing it as a feature and trying to understand how the feature works. And one of the things that I think definitely is important in the way concepts work in spite of this seeming disunity is that they have a variety of connections between the different interpretations. They're not just unconnected islands, but have been described as a kind of patchwork. And we can better describe the complicated behavior of a cluster of terminology around traits or characters in terms of a patchwork with interconnections. And those interpatch relations arise from things like domain overlap and technique coordination. There's lots of ways in which other philosophers have nicely highlighted some of these features, as well as diagrammed them, such as in this case for the concept of hardness from material science. And so the important thing is not just that you have the different interpretive patches, but that you actually have an account of how those patches relate to one another and under what conditions you can move between them. Patchworks in scientific praxis accent the importance of operationalization and measurement in giving meaning to scientific terms. The documentation of interpatch relations illuminates why particular inferences are licensed and others are ignored or elided, as well as why methodological combinations take specific sequences. So sometimes research has a clear, this happens first and this happens second. And I think that Sometimes what's actually happening is you're moving between patches in a particular way. And a key interpatch relation is sharing a general reasoning strategy that is stepwise and principled, so you know how you can move and why, which can link together distinct patches connecting different epistemic and pragmatic goals of research communities and provide normative guidance for extending concepts to new domains. So here I'm drawing on the work of others to put together this idea of the conceptual neighborhoods with the idea of the patchwork, which I think are complementary, to give us a picture of scientific concepts that starts to make sense of why the biological trait concept would behave the way that it does and exhibit these features of different theoretical commitments leading to different accounts of what is or is not the character. And we can see that, I think, in a couple nice ways in the context that we're talking about. So first off, a nice consequence of this account is it helps dissolve the controversy about whether the human chin is a genuine character. For anybody who spent time in this literature, you'll know a little bit about this. It also is in the Gould and Lewontin paper, but there's a lot of subsequent literature. People have worried, oh, it's not an individualized character, but rather a side effect of the relative sizes of two growth fields. Is it a consequence of removing airway impedance? Is it mechanical support for mastication or speech? It's a sexually selected ornament for males with high androgen levels. That's just to get started. That's not all of them. Well, there is no univocal answer as to whether the human chin is a trait. It depends on the differing theoretical commitments about what counts as a trait, and therefore it's not a surprise that you get this array of responses that in some sense need to better recognize that what counts as a human chin or not depends on those commitments, and then we can move past some of the dull thud of differences here. A second consequence, I think, is the one that is very close to work I've done for many years, which is the perennial controversy about the origin of evolutionary novelty among biologists arises from the patchwork nature of the trait concept. Because many researchers operate with a primary conception of traits, they also conceptualize the origin of new traits in light of this commitment. So if you have a notion of what counts as a trait, then when you say, what does it mean for a new trait to originate, you're going to be thinking in terms of that conception. Differences in theoretical commitments about traits predict that biologists will likely come to opposite conclusions about what counts as a novelty, including what processes might or might not need to be considered to explain their origin in the history of life. And I've actually had these conversations actively with biologists, so this one I know from personal experience. So let me now move from talking about those epistemological considerations that kind of support what I'm calling a principled pluralism to saying, what is in a patch? What is in one of those sort of theoretical set of commitments with allied concepts around it in biology? And recall our situation, right? We know now we're not only observing this, but actually expecting it, not one size fits all. But we don't necessarily have as much systematic resources to draw on. So a key difference in some respects with some of the other literature is that we don't have maybe the patches mapped out as well. So can we not just say there needs to be an answer, but provide a little bit of what an answer looks like, at least for one of the patch? Can we make progress by developing new theory that constitutes an answer to what counts as a new trait, or counts as a trait? And that's what I've been doing for the last several years with Gunter Wagner, biologist, James DeFrisco, philosopher who is now actually moving into the sciences, at least in terms of institutional location, where we've been collaborating to try and build out an account of what we call character identity mechanisms. On this account, character identity is not just a morphological fact, but also something controlled and explained by distinctive causal mechanisms operating in development with consequences for evolutionary persistence and traceability. Got both developmental and evolutionary individuality kind of in view. Character identity is contrasted with mere similarity between characters and with character states, thematic variations that characters with a given identity may have, such as the size or shape of a wing. The CHIM framework is intended as an abstract model that includes previously studied identity mechanisms as particular realizations, while offering a richer and more general account of character identity and homology. So broadly, just for context, it's actually a view that sits closer to developmental and structural considerations in that big space that we were looking at earlier. It's just not monist because it's not saying this is all there is to what counts as a character or trait. It broadens consideration beyond gene regulatory networks within cells as the exclusive or definitive mode of developmental causality by taking into account factors like protein-protein interactions, non-coding RNA, and the role of cell-cell signaling interactions, and extracellular matrix in the organization of complex tissues and organs. In particular, CHIMs for anatomical units at different levels of organization have different components and activities, which is conducive to traceability and comparative work. So you'll notice already that part of the thing we identified in the conceptual neighborhood that's important, levels of organization, is actually built into this account and part of it. And in fact, you can see this in terms of how we can think about different types of activities, simple and complex at different levels of organization, as well as different aspects of mechanisms that we might want to trace in doing comparative mechanistic biology. Character identity mechanisms have a kind of causal profile. Causal profile has 4 basic elements. They're actively modular, having parts that maintain one another, and they negatively inhibit alternative regulatory states. They have a complex organization, multiple heterogeneous components organized to yield dynamics that are not a simple or cumulative consequence of the activities of individual genes. There's interdependence. CHIM components and activities are necessary for each other's functioning, as well as collectively necessary for the development of the associated character because of their switch-like activation of downstream processes. And they're causally non-redundant. Disruptive perturbations of CHIMs tend to have catastrophic rather than minor graded effects. And so in trying to capture some of this visually in terms of what kind of cartoon layout, what that looks like is these sort of choke points in a bow tie causal structure that happen in development that are able to handle some variation, but not nearly as much variation as other processes might, either before or after the character identity mechanism is operative. Now, in addition to that basic framework, there's a couple motivations for theorizing about characters in this way that sort of pushed us. And it's important, I think, to highlight those because they help make sense of why the theoretical commitments take the shape that they do. One is responding to an empirical puzzle. Empirical studies in evo devo have built a strong case that homologous traits are induced by different signaling pathways in different species or arise from different germ layers and cell populations. Might just call this variability. Broadly, developmental systems drift is actually the way biologists would describe this feature. Empirical studies in evo devo have also shown that some developmental mechanisms for metazoan traits, such as eyes and limbs, appear more conserved than initially thought, exhibiting substantive similarity across wide phylogenetic distances. Call that conservation. Well, the CHIM model is intentionally situated in an intermediate position because it's trying to recognize the empirical findings and make sense of what is actually conserved, what is actually variable, and can we make sense of that in terms of what counts as a character and a mechanism underlying it. A second motivation is seeking generalization where it can be secured. Anybody have read about whether there's laws in biology at some point? There's always a concern about how wide do generalizations go in terms of scope. The abstract account of CHIMs establishes a more general theoretical basis for character traceability to facilitate empirical investigation, and it generalizes across levels of organization. And this is important because most previous discussions have tended to be focused on cell types. and look at only one level of organization. And so part of what's built into the CHIMS account is not only a recognition that levels of organization are important, but also the ways in which the account suggests different things at different levels. So if you're focusing on the tissue level, you're focusing on the tissue level, then you're going to expect certain things. Those are not necessarily the same things you would expect at the cell level or at the organ level. And so we've got theoretical expectations that differ specifically by calibrating in terms of levels of organization. A third motivation is criticizing concepts that do not facilitate epistemic progress. One of those is the idea of deep homology, which has been advocated by a number of scientists. I won't go into the details for the sake of time, but it turns out that it has limited descriptive utility, in part because it can't separate homology from other things. The disparate doesn't actually have a precise meaning in research. It's not distinguishable from ordinary gene sharing and pleiotropy, and does not provide any criteria for what a shared apparatus would be, and therefore you can't give a good account of what would be a co-option of that genetic regulatory apparatus in evolution. Another concept, which also, as you might notice, is responding to this conservation variability empirical tension that we already talked about, says, well, look, maybe everything's just partially homologous in certain ways. But this has its own set of problems, because since there's some sharing of, at least on some accounts, everything is shared, the whole distinction between homology and non-homology breaks down and threatens comparative morphological knowledge generally, implies that nothing is a novelty and everything is partially novel. For any pair of characters, they're only more or less diverged, and introduces confusions about homology at different levels, and there hasn't been any relevant specification of what those degrees of similarity are. So there's a need, in part, to articulate a trait concept in this space, because some of the distinctions available in this space are problematic and not doing appropriate work. Finally, the last motivation was elaborating a framework to go beyond our currently available distinctions. In what way does the theoretical commitments here push us into new terrain and suggest things that we may not have thought about or may not have made distinctions about in the past? Introducing distinctions to extant concepts, revising or narrowing their original meaning, to produce increased contrastive resolution among labels used to represent biological phenomena. One of those, we think, is distinguishing aspects of character state differences, which hasn't been done in this space. The difference between a configuration of subparts as opposed to differences in the attributes that a character might have. We actually enrich the notion of co-option itself so that we can get better traction in a way that, say, deep homology didn't give us, plus a mechanistic account to body plans, which have themselves been a controversial idea and not very amenable to experimental investigation. And also, we distinguish different kinds of serial features, which have been controversial in their status for more than 100 years for sure, and their application to complex empirical cases in evo-devo. And I show you this because it's a kind of snapshot of that. This is from our recent paper in the Journal of Morphology, where we actually introduce new terms to capture those distinctions. Terms that are not necessarily used by the community in this way, but we're advocating for their use because they, at least to us, seem to introduce the requisite clarity and help then do further work with respect to, say, traceability in comparative biology. So I know that was a bit of a whirlwind of the view, but what I wanted to highlight there is that the abstract epistemological considerations that we talked about for scientific concepts and the idea of patches and them having structure can actually be seen in this sort of theoretical account. We can exemplify some of those features, and I think really fulfill Hull's promise 50 years later in some respects and be of help with the question, what is a character? And in that same paper, Hall said the efforts of biologists to clarify the ideas of character and homology have been excursions into pure epistemology, to which philosophers can happily co-travel with the biologists in that space to do this kind of work. Importantly, the account that I'm talking about here, which is a principled pluralism, does have normative bite. So it calls out these sorts of dichotomous framings as problematic, and also is going to reject certain expectations that scientists might have when they talk about concepts. So in this case, Freudenstein claiming that it's important that an internally consistent, non-arbitrary yet flexible way of viewing characters be available that can accommodate any type of organismal aspect. And from what we've just considered, that's actually not what you want, and that's not what you should be trying to go after. So the basis for the normativity, just to reiterate, is an understanding of scientific concepts as having patchwork structure with associated neighborhoods of other concepts, which generates a circumscribed principle of pluralism, and the theoretical account of one of those patches and its neighborhood. The Chim's account is developed at a fine scale and oriented to utility and ongoing scientific inquiry, showing how there can be some real payoff for this in the sciences. So to review, as I finish, we began by talking about the theoretical question of what constitutes a biological trait and how that's not been systematically explored in contemporary life science, in part because of the disciplinary diversity that is there. That heterogeneity and inconsistency in how biologists use the trait concept is subject to a number of different factors, methods, models, questions, and disciplines. When we start looking at biologists talking about traits, they give us at least clues to the sorts of things that are relevant for characterizing traits. And although on the principled pluralism I've been arguing for, there's a more than one legitimate theoretical answer, we do need to be clear in advancing what those theoretical answers look like, rather than somehow simply saying that nothing more needs to be said. And that involves both rejecting things like the problematic options of conventionalism, functional monism, and structural monism, but as well recognizing what should we expect from our scientific concepts and how should they behave, and not saddling them with inappropriate expectations, and actually paying attention to the places where there should be things of substance that maybe aren't there. And that's part of the reason for us being motivated to advance the character identity mechanisms model, because we think it's one well-motivated way to advance theory about biological traits for ongoing inquiry. With that, I'll stop, say thank you, and look forward to the conversation.
You want to start? Please raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That